Night, Alabama, 1833. The Caldwell dining hall glows with candlelight, but the air is wrong, too still, too heavy. A fork clatters, wine splashes across the white linen like a wound opening. John Caldwell claws at his throat, lips foaming, eyes wide. Annabelle screams, her pearls snapping loose, scattering like tiny bones across the floor. Chairs topple, dishes shatter. The rich feast turns bitter on every tongue. And in the middle of it all, a woman stands silent, silver cross glinting at her neck, eyes fixed steady. In that house of plenty, death was served in silence. The Caldwell plantation stretched across red Alabama earth, cotton fields rippling under the hot wind. The mansion rose in the distance, white columns gleaming, a monument built on backs that bent and broke. By day the sound was picking, hands tearing at thorned cotton. By night it was the cracking whip and muffled cries that echoed in the quarters. In the yard an old man shuffled with a wooden bucket. His hands shook, his back bent, but his eyes, clouded as they were, missed nothing. Samuel Price, the others called him, the one who remembered everything. He had lived through 3 masters, seen children born, sold, whipped, buried. His beard was thin and gray, his voice like gravel. He paused by the well, muttering, "A house this big, it don't stay clean. It soaks up blood even if you scrub." Near the kitchen door, a young girl carried baskets of vegetables, steps too fast, shoulders too tense. She was Martha Lee, barely 14, always listening, always glancing over her shoulder as though she expected shadows to speak. She worked beside the cook but was known for slipping into corners, ears sharp as knives. "Don't linger, child," Samuel warned, watching her hover by the kitchen window. "Walls here got mouths. They'll swallow you if you stay too close." Martha hugged the basket to her chest. I hear things, Mr. Samuel, voices behind doors." He chuckled without mirth. "Voices behind doors is what keeps us alive." From the kitchen came the thick smell of roasting meat, onions frying in grease. Wealth reeked in the air, silk dresses, polished silver, perfume floating over sweat. Martha peeked in and saw Master Caldwell striding across the dining room, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor. The riding crop swung casually at his side, though no horse was near. She ducked back quickly, whispering, "He walks like the devil owns his feet." Samuel lowered his bucket slowly, nodding. "He owns more than that. He owns the breath in your chest, girl. At least that's what he believes." The plantation's wealth was spoken of in town with envy. The Caldwell name carried weight, whispered in saloons and on church pews. But among the enslaved, it was spoken with dread. Stories traveled, of a master who laughed when he whipped, of a wife who smiled through cruelty, of an overseer whose thirst for whiskey was matched only by his thirst for blood. Yet within these walls, silence was demanded. Every cry muffled, every secret buried. The house itself seemed to feed on that silence. Samuel's cloudy eyes lifted toward the mansion. "You mark my words, Martha. No house built on chains can stand forever. One day it crumbles. One day, even the walls scream back." Martha clutched the basket tighter. She didn't answer, but in her gaze lingered a question she dared not speak. When? And inside the Caldwell mansion, the first notes of a lullaby, soft, faint, almost imagined, brushed against the silence like a ghost at the door. The lullaby came first, drifting through the slave quarters long before dawn. It belonged to Ruth, a seamstress whose voice was soft enough to soothe crying babies, yet strong enough to cut through hunger. She stitched clothes for the Caldwell family by day, but by night she sang to her daughter Clara, a girl with sharp eyes and a silver cross hung around her neck. "Sleep, my child," Ruth whispered, brushing back Clara's hair. "One day chains will break." Clara held the cross tightly, the metal cool against her skin. "Mama," she asked, "why do they whip us? Why they don't whip themselves?" Ruth's needle paused mid-stitch. Her silence answered more than words could. Then she hummed again, the same tune, weaving sorrow into comfort. That lullaby, fragile as it was, planted itself deep inside Clara, an heirloom more lasting than thread or cloth. By the time Clara was 10, she knew her mother's hands better than her own. Ruth's fingers carried scars, thin lines from needles, thicker ones from whips. Still her hands worked tirelessly, pulling thread through silk and cotton, crafting beauty for those who despised her existence. One afternoon, Clara crept into the big house barefoot, carrying folded linens. She lingered in the doorway of the parlor, where Master John Caldwell sat in his leather chair, boots propped up, crop laid across his knee like a scepter. His face was clean-shaven, jaw sharp, his voice commanding. Even at rest, he radiated authority, a man who believed he was the law. "Girl," he said without lifting his eyes from his ledger. "Bring that here." Clara froze. "Now," he barked, the whip tapping against the chair. She rushed forward, nearly dropping the linens. His gaze finally cut to her, cold, assessing, as if weighing not just her small frame but the value of her entire bloodline. "You're Ruth's whelp, aren't you?" "Yes, master." Her voice trembled. He leaned forward, gripping her chin in one hand. His fingers dug into her skin. "Strong eyes," he muttered. "That can be dangerous in a slave. Best you learn to lower them." He released her abruptly, returning to his ledger. "Go on, and tell your mother she works late tonight. My wife wants a new dress for Sunday." Clara stumbled out, heart pounding. She pressed her fingers to her chin where his grip lingered, leaving an invisible bruise that burned deeper than flesh. That night, Ruth held her daughter close, humming the lullaby once more. Clara whispered, "Mama, I'll never bow my eyes." Not to him. Ruth's smile was weary, touched with both pride and fear. "Then you'll need strength greater than mine, child." The silver cross around Clara's neck caught the firelight. It gleamed like a promise. From that day forward, Clara's innocence began to wither. In its place grew something colder, sharper. She carried her mother's lullaby like a blade hidden in song. And somewhere in the shadows of the mansion, John Caldwell smiled to himself, certain the house would always obey. Clara grew tall and steady, her mother's lullabies buried in her chest like coals waiting for breath. By 16, she had taken Ruth's place in the sewing room, her hands quick, her back straight, her silver cross always hanging at her throat. To the Caldwell family, she was invisible until needed, yet to those in the quarters, her sharp tongue and steady gaze made her a quiet leader. One humid evening, she carried scraps of fabric back to the quarters when a whisper cut the dark. "Clara." Elias stepped out from the shadows of the stable, lantern light catching the sweat on his brow. His shirt was loose, his hands rough, smelling of hay and horse. He was only a year older than her, but taller, shoulders broad, eyes soft. He held something small in his palm. A dried rose petal pressed flat and fragile. "Found it behind the mistress's mirror," he said, slipping it into her hand. "Didn't think she'd miss one. Thought maybe you'd keep it." Clara laughed softly, tucking it into her dress. "It'll crumble in a day. Then I'll find you another." Elias answered, voice low. "Sure." Their love lived in fragments, stolen glances, brief touches in shadow, whispered promises. In the quarters, everyone knew but no one spoke, for words could betray them quicker than chains. One night, as they lay hidden near the fields, Elias whispered, "One day, I'll buy us freedom." "There's men in town who say it can be done." Clara touched the silver cross. "And if you can't, then I'll still keep you alive," he said. "That's promise enough." But promises broke easier than twigs underfoot. Overseer Thomas Calhoun was the kind of man whose presence soured air. He was broad-shouldered, red-faced, with whiskey breath and a whip that rarely left his grip. He liked to laugh when others winced. He tapped the whip handle against his leg as though it were a drumbeat of power. He noticed Clara's defiance. He noticed Elias's glances. One sweltering afternoon, he cornered Clara in the yard, his shadow cutting across her path. "Girl," he slurred, his grin crooked. "You keep your eyes down, else I'll take them from you." Clara stiffened but said nothing. Thomas leaned closer, his whisper dripping with poison. "And that boy, Elias? I'll see him sold downriver before summer's end, just to watch you cry." True to his word, within weeks Elias was chained, marched across the yard as Clara watched from the sewing room window. He met her gaze only once. His lips shaped words without sound. "Remember me." Clara pressed the rose petal to her chest until it crumbled to dust. Her grief hardened into rage, a blade sharpening in silence. It was then she turned to Aunt Bess. Bess was the oldest woman on the plantation. Her back stooped, hair wrapped in faded cloth. She carried the smell of herbs, mint, sage, bitterroot. By day she delivered babies and soothed fevers. By night she whispered secrets over pots and jars, secrets the masters feared but never dared speak of. Clara found her one evening, hands shaking, voice brittle. "Teach me." Bess looked her over, eyes slow and deep. "Teach you what, child? How to fight without chains? How to make them choke like they make us bleed. The old woman crushed seeds with a mortar, the sound grinding like bones. What I know heals, she said carefully. But what heals can also kill. And once you learn that, child, you can't unlearn it. I don't want to unlearn, Clara whispered. Bess studied her long, then pressed a sprig of oleander into her hand. Its leaves were green, its flowers sweet, its roots deadly. This plant can be friend or enemy. Depends on how you grind it, how you serve it, how much you pray over it. Clara inhaled its scent, sweet at first, then bitter as bile. Bess leaned close, her voice almost a growl. Poison is patience, Clara. It waits. It whispers. And when it strikes, it don't miss. From that night on, Clara carried 2 heirlooms, her mother's lullaby and Bess's herbs. One sang of love, the other of death. Together they formed a weapon the Caldwells would never see coming. The overseer laughed louder. Master Caldwell strutted prouder. Annabel sipped her laudanum with pale fingers. None of them noticed the girl whose eyes no longer bowed, but Samuel Price did. Watching from the well, he muttered to himself, "She carries fire under her skin. Fire burns houses down." And in the still of night, as chains rattled softly in the quarters, Clara ground herbs under the watchful gaze of Aunt Bess, her cross catching the moonlight. The summer of 1832 burned hotter than memory. Heat hung over the fields like a curse, sweat rolling down backs, dust clinging to every breath. In the big house, John Caldwell decided it was time for a lesson, one that would brand itself into the flesh of every enslaved soul. The yard was cleared, benches dragged forward. The whip coiled in Thomas Calhoun's hand like a snake eager to strike. Samuel Price stood near the well, silent, his cloudy eyes fixed. Martha Lee crouched at the edge of the kitchen door, clutching her apron, heart pounding, and Clara was summoned to serve. She carried a tray of wine glasses, crystal gleaming cruelly in the sun. The silver cross at her neck felt like lead. Her steps were steady, though her stomach churned. Caldwell's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. "Bring him out." 2 men dragged Elias into the yard. Chains rattled at his ankles, wrists bound tight. His shirt was torn, back marked with old scars and fresh cuts. His eyes searched the crowd until they found Clara. For a breath, the world shrank to that single look, his lips shaping her name without sound. Clara's knees nearly buckled. The tray trembled in her hands. Thomas cracked the whip in the air, grinning. "Now this," he said, his voice thick with whiskey. "This is what happens when a boy forgets his place." Caldwell raised his glass, nodding. "Let it be known, a slave's love is worth less than the dirt on my boots." The words cut deeper than any lash. Clara bit her tongue until blood filled her mouth. The whip came down. Once, twice, 10 times. Elias's cries tore the air, each one searing into Clara's chest like a brand. The crowd shifted uneasily, some turning away, others forced to watch. Annabel Caldwell sat beneath a parasol, sipping laudanum from a silver vial, her expression calm, as if the spectacle were nothing more than theater. She leaned to her husband, murmuring, "John, do hurry. The sun is dreadful today." Clara's nails dug into her palm until her skin broke. Blood smeared across the tray handle. Finally, Elias collapsed, the chains dragging him face first into the dust. Caldwell waved dismissively. "Take him, sell him. I don't care where, just far enough that this girl never sees him again." Clara gasped. Her eyes shot to Caldwell, but he never looked back at her. To him, Elias was not a man, only a warning. The guards dragged Elias away. His gaze locked on Clara one last time. His mouth moved, forming words she could not hear. She wanted to run, to scream, to tear the whip from Thomas's hand and carve justice into their skin, but her body stayed frozen. Her cross burned against her chest, searing her with its weight. The crowd dispersed slowly, silence heavier than chains. Martha Lee crept from the kitchen doorway, tears streaking her cheeks. Samuel Price shook his head, whispering under his breath, "This house feeds on souls. One day it'll choke." Clara stood alone in the yard, her hands trembling over the empty tray. The ground where Elias had fallen still bore the shape of his body, pressed into the dirt like a grave. That night, she sat by the fire with Aunt Bess. The old woman ground herbs, the scent rising sharp and bitter. Clara stared into the flames, voice low and steady. "I'll make him choke. I'll make them all choke." Bess's eyes flickered up, searching her face. "Child, that road don't end in mercy." "I don't want mercy," Clara whispered. "I want silence. Their silence." The lullaby her mother once sang floated in her memory, twisted now into something darker. She hummed it under her breath, each note a vow. The fire cracked, sparks rising like spirits, and Clara's heart turned to iron. Night settled like wool. The quarter smelled of sweat, starch, and the bitter tang of crushed herbs. Clara moved with a quiet that belonged to the hunted. She spoke little. When she did, her voice was measured, each word a small blade. "Bess," Clara said, fingers steady on a mortar. "How much will it take to fell a man like a tree? 1 pinch? A handful?" Aunt Bess did not look up. "Depends on the heart of the man and the stubbornness of the poison. Oleander bites slow. Oleander sings before it kills. You want them to suffer slow so the memory sticks." Her thumb pressed into the leaves, releasing a bitter almond-sour scent that curled in the air. Peter burst in without knocking. Cheeks flushed, apron smeared with gravy. He carried a stack of plates like they were precarious altars. The boy kept hopping on one foot when nervous, a habit everyone noticed. "Miss Clara, there's a tray waitin' for the big house." "Master says hurry." Clara nodded, the cross at her throat catching the lamplight. "Tell the cook I'll be there in a turn." She palmed a small packet of powdered herb and slid it into the hem of her apron, fingers folding the cloth with the practiced care of a seamstress. She met Peter's gaze for a heartbeat, something like guilt softening her eyes. "You sure you're well?" Peter said, voice thin. "You look tired." "I'm fine." Her smile was brief. "Fetch the trays, Peter, and don't dawdle." He hopped away, plates clinking. As the door side closed, Martha Lee's shadow lingered in the doorway. Too close, too curious. Martha had begun to watch Clara more than anyone, a young girl whose ears had turned into spies. "Clara?" Martha's whisper trembled. "I thought you were sleeping." Clara straightened slowly. "Go back to bed, Martha. These are not songs for the young." Martha's fingers brushed the edge of the table, nearly knocking over the mortar. Aunt Bess's eyes narrowed. "Soft feet, girl. Soft feet keep you alive." Hours folded into plans. They mapped the servants' routines: when the master ate, when Annabelle took laudanum, when Thomas roamed drunk. Clara recorded times in her head like notches on a stick. She whispered instructions to Bess. How to grind, how to dry the petals, how to hide the dust in a spice jar with the red lid that never left the kitchen shelf. Each step was small and ordinary, a pinch here, a spoon there, domestics disguising another intent. Near catch one. Thomas Calhoun stumbled into the back kitchen, forcing the lantern light across the table. He smelled the herbs, an almost sour wisp, and frowned. "Who's been handling the spices?" His voice rolled like thunder. Clara's hand froze above the jar. She kept her shoulders calm. The lullaby from Ruth pressed tight under her ribs like a metronome. "Just me, sir," she answered, turning as if to fold napkins. Thomas's eyes lingered on her apron, then on the hem where something bulged. He reached out, his fingers grazing cloth, then snatched his hand back. At the same moment, the kitchen door slammed open and Peter bounded in, yelling about dropped trays. The moment dissolved. Thomas cursed and left, laughing with his throat full of whiskey. The laugh scraped like a blade. Near catch two. Martha hovered again, a plate in hand, and nearly looked directly into the mortar. For a second, her face shifted. Suspicion, pity. Then she blinked and gave a small, distracted smile. Clara shoved the bowl away with a laugh that was too bright, too quick. "Clumsy hands," she said, and the lies settled like dust. They rehearsed routes, timings, excuses. Clara slept with the spice jar under her palate, cross cool against her skin. Bess placed a tiny folded letter into Clara's hand. No names, only a place and a time, scrawled for someone beyond the river who might one day listen. As dawn bled pale through the shutters, Clara tightened the knot at her waist. The lullaby hummed in her mouth. Outside, the mastiff barked, then stopped. From the yard came a single heavy bootstep, deliberate and near. She did not move. The night of the feast came heavy with rain. Lanterns lined the Calhoun house, their flames smearing gold against wet glass. Inside, laughter swelled, the brittle laughter of men who drank to drown their rot. The smell of roasted pork mingled with perfume and damp tobacco. Shadows shifted on the wallpaper like specters waiting their turn. Clara carried the first tray in silence. Her hands were steady, but her throat pulsed. The silver pitcher gleamed like a mirror, and in its reflection her eyes looked like someone else's, older, sharper. Aunt Bess's warning rattled in her skull. Oleander sings before it kills. At the long table sat Henry Calhoun, proud in a waistcoat the color of dried blood. Beside him, Annabelle fanned herself, though the air was cool, her wrists heavy with pearls. Thomas lounged at the end, whiskey spilling from his glass, while neighbors and overseers filled the remaining seats. Their voices rose and collided, the language of ownership and indulgence. Henry lifted his hand. "Clara, bring the wine. Tonight we drink to prosperity," she nodded. "Yes, master." She poured crimson liquid tumbling into glass after glass. As the last was filled, she brushed her fingers over the packet hidden in her apron. No one noticed the faint white cloud dissolve into red. Peter appeared at the doorway, eyes wide. He balanced another tray, but his gaze clung to Clara, wordless. She glanced once at him, an unspoken plea, "Say nothing." He trembled, then dropped his eyes. Annabelle raised her glass first, pearls catching the candlelight. "To fortune," she declared. "To fortune," echoed the room. They drank. Clara stepped back, her breath shallow. The lullaby swelled in her memory, notes carrying across years. "Hush, hush, the fire sleeps." Minutes passed. Henry chuckled at some crude joke, slapping Thomas's back. Then his hand faltered, sliding across the tablecloth. The glass tipped, spilling wine like a wound. He cleared his throat once, twice, his face flushing crimson. Annabelle frowned. "Henry, what is it?" She stopped. Her hand trembled, fan slipping from her grasp. Thomas laughed. "Too much wine, old man?" But even as he mocked, his own jaw slackened, words garbled. One by one, voices cracked. Coughs erupted. Chairs screeched against wood. A neighbor doubled over, retching. Another clawed at his collar, eyes wide with animal terror. Clara stood still, hands clasped before her, cross-pressed between her palms. Henry rose unsteadily, knocking over the high-backed chair. What have you done?" His voice was broken glass. He stumbled toward Clara, eyes blazing. But his knees buckled. He crashed to the floor, the pearls from Annabelle's wrist scattering across the planks like spilled teeth. The room descended into chaos. Men gasped, choking, clawing at their throats. The smell of bile and spilt wine filled the air. The mastiff barked furiously outside, sensing something deathly. Clara moved as if detached from her body. She retrieved the pitcher, tipped it slowly into the hearth. Flames hissed, then flared green for a heartbeat. A symbol burned in the eyes of those who could still see. Fire swallowing poison. Peter dropped his tray, dishes shattering. "Clara!" His voice cracked, torn between terror and awe. She turned, her eyes wet. "Go, Peter, run to the quarters. Tell no one," but he did not move. He stared, paralyzed as Thomas staggered upright, fury and whiskey mixing in his veins. "You witch," Thomas spat, his words slurred but sharp. "You'll hang for this." He lunged, knife half pulled from his belt. Clara froze. Then Aunt Bess's figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Her gnarled hands gripped the iron poker. With a single cry, she brought it down. The sound was dull, final. Thomas collapsed, his knife clattering uselessly across the boards. The others convulsed. Annabelle's last breath came as a thin whisper, pearls rattling against the floor. Neighbors writhed, gasped, and fell still, their boots drumming faintly against the table's legs before silence overtook them. Outside, the rain battered the shutters. Lightning cracked, illuminating the carnage in stark flashes. Bodies sprawled, eyes wide, mouths open in eternal accusation. Martha Lee appeared in the doorway, her face pale as bone. She clutched the frame, lips trembling. "Clara, what have you done?" Clara turned slowly, her dress splattered red from spilled wine and blood. Her voice was steady, almost tender. "I did what no one else dared. I did what memory demanded." Peter whispered. "They'll come for us. Soldiers. Ropes." Clara stepped closer, her palm resting on his shoulder. "Maybe. But tonight we are free." The lullaby returned, rising faintly from Clara's lips. Aunt Bess hummed along, voice cracked but strong. The sound filled the house where groans had fallen silent. Martha shook her head, tears streaking. "This ain't freedom. This is doom." But even as she spoke, others from the quarters appeared, drawn by the noise, the crash of glass, the silence after. Faces pressed against the doorway, wide-eyed, unbelieving. They saw the fallen masters, the spilled pearls, the iron poker slick with blood. They saw Clara standing, cross-glinting, voice steady as she sang. For a moment, none spoke. Then one voice broke through, a man's, hoarse with awe. "She did it," another whispered. "Chains don't rattle no more." Clara raised her chin. "Go back," she ordered. Say nothing. The storm will cover the cries. But remember this night. Remember it in silence, in song, in fire. Outside thunder roared. Inside the flames in the hearth snapped and spat, devouring the poisoned wine. Shadows danced over the walls like ghosts set free. Clara stood among the fallen, her heart beating slow and heavy. She had not begged. She had not run. And in that moment the silence screamed louder than any gun. Morning crept slow, gray as ash. Smoke from the hearth clung to the rafters, mingling with the sour stench of vomit, wine, and death. The Calhoun mansion no longer sang with laughter. It whispered with the groans of settling beams, with the creak of chairs still knocked askew. Henry Calhoun's body lay sprawled by the table, eyes fixed on nothing. Annabelle's pearls were scattered like a rosary broken mid-prayer. Thomas Calhoun, skull fractured, rested beneath the table's edge where Aunt Bess had struck. Neighbors and overseers lay twisted, their boots muddied, their mouths open as if to shout a curse they never finished. Clara stood still. Her face was pale but unreadable. The cross at her throat had turned sticky with sweat. Aunt Bess leaned against the wall, chest heaving, iron poker still dark with blood. Peter crouched in a corner, arms wrapped around his knees. Whispering fragments of prayer outside, voices rose. Shouts, barking. The mastiff had not quieted. "They'll come," Martha Lee whispered, eyes darting toward the door. Her face was tight with fear. "They'll come with guns, with torches. They'll burn us alive for this." Clara's voice was low but clear. "Then let them come." Peter shook his head violently. "You don't understand. There'll be no mercy. They'll hang you from the tree by the river." "I was already hanging," Clara said, stepping toward the table, touching the spilled pearls with her fingers. "Every day. Rope or no rope, I was choking." The door burst open. White men in riding coats stormed inside, pistols drawn. One knelt by Henry's body, pressing fingers to his throat. "Dead," he muttered. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Clara standing calm. "Who did this?" No one answered. The overseer from a neighboring plantation pointed at Clara. "Her. She poured the wine. I saw it with my own eyes. She poisoned them," Martha blurted, trembling. "She killed them all." Clara turned to her, expression unreadable. "Child," she said softly, "your fear will bury me faster than any rope." The men seized Clara, dragging her toward the door. Aunt Bess tried to lunge forward, but a rifle butt shoved her to the floor. Peter cried out, "She did it for us!" But his voice was drowned beneath the men's curses. The trial came swift. In the courthouse, the air stank of sweat and ink. A crowd gathered, whispering, spitting, jeering. Clara stood shackled in iron chains, wrists raw. She looked smaller, yet unbroken. The judge's gavel struck. "Clara," he announced, "you stand accused of poisoning Henry Calhoun, Annabelle Calhoun, Thomas Calhoun, and their honored guests. How do you plead?" Clara raised her chin. Her voice carried, steady as stone. "Guilty." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor sneered. "She admits it then. No trial is needed. The gallows will settle this." But Clara spoke again, louder this time. "I am guilty of what you call murder. But what of the lashes that carved my brother's back? What of the hunger that gnawed my kin? What of the fire in Ruth's lungs as she sang her last lullaby? Who stands guilty for that?" Murmurs spread through the gallery. Some looked down, ashamed. Others shouted for silence. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough, this is no place for her poison words. Sentence is death by hanging at first light." That night in her cell, the silence was thick. Moonlight spilled across the floor, silver bars on black stone. Aunt Bess's voice carried faintly through the crack in the wall. "You gave them a song they'll never forget," Bess whispered. Clara leaned her head back against the wall. "Songs fade, Bess, ropes don't." But Bess only hummed Ruth's lullaby, the same slow, mournful tune. At dawn, the square filled with bodies. White townsfolk pressed forward, eager for vengeance. Among them stood enslaved men and women, silent, their faces blank masks. Chains clinked as Clara was dragged onto the scaffold. The preacher read scripture, words hollow in the morning air. The hangman tightened the noose, rough hemp biting into her skin. From the crowd, Peter's voice rang out, high and desperate. "Clara, forgive me." She found him with her eyes, small, trembling, clutching his apron. She gave him the faintest smile. "Live," she mouthed. Martha stood farther back, tears streaking her face. She tried to look away, but her gaze clung to Clara as though shackled. The judge raised his hand. "Do you have final words?" Clara's voice rose, clear enough to slice the air. "Yes, you may hang my body, but my song will not die. The fire you stoked will burn long after me." The lever fell. The rope snapped taut. Silence crushed the square. Some cheered. Others crossed themselves. But in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the fields, a different sound began. A whisper, a hum, a lullaby carried from mouth to mouth. Weeks later, the Calhoun mansion stood empty. Vines crawled across the porch, shutters banged in the wind. Children dared each other to creep inside. They said the air still stank of poison. They said you could hear a woman singing by the hearth when the fire burned low. In the fields, workers sang quietly to themselves. Not hymns, not work chants, but Clara's lullaby. It slipped through cotton rows like smoke. Uncatchable. Martha Lee, grown but still haunted, told the tale in hushed tones to younger slaves. How Clara stood tall, how she never begged, how she burned her name into memory with one night of fire and poison. And in secret, Peter carried the story too. Though guilt gnawed at him, he spoke Clara's name when no masters listened. He swore her song would never vanish. In the end, the Calhouns were buried in grand coffins, their deaths spoken of with outrage in the halls of power. Clara's body swung briefly, then was cut down, her grave unmarked. Yet it was her name, whispered, sung, feared, that lingered. The masters were remembered for their wealth. Clara was remembered for her fire, and in Alabama, long after the poison faded, the silence of that night still screamed louder than any gun. Years passed, and the Calhoun story refused to die. On the surface, planters told it as a warning. See what happens when slaves are trusted too much. Preachers folded it into sermons about sin and punishment. In courtrooms, her name was spat like venom, Clara the poisoner. But beneath, in the hush of night, the tale shifted, reshaped like smoke between hands. Among the enslaved, Clara became more than flesh. She became a whisper of resistance. Her name carried in lullabies disguised as ordinary songs. Mothers crooned, "Hush, hush, the fire sleeps," but everyone listening knew it was Clara's fire. When chains rattled too loud, someone would murmur, "Remember Clara," and silence would fall, heavy with meaning. In kitchens, women told it while grinding herbs, how Clara ground oleander into powder, how she poured it with steady hands, how she never trembled. Each woman added details. Some swore she sang as they choked. Others claimed she looked her master in the eyes until he fell. Whether truth or legend, each retelling made her bolder. Peter, grown into a man with scars of his own, carried the memory differently. Guilt shadowed him, but so did pride. He told children by the river she didn't beg, she didn't run. His voice would crack, but he spoke anyway because the silence was worse. Martha Lee grew into a mother. She whispered Clara's name to her children, half in reverence, half in fear. "Don't be like her," she warned, though her eyes betrayed awe. Bravery brings the rope. Yet her children remembered only the awe, not the warning. Even white townsfolk couldn't erase the story. They painted Clara as a demon, a witch with herbs and hexes. They whispered that her ghost haunted the Calhoun house, that her song curled up the chimneys on storm nights. They said dogs wouldn't step onto the porch and horses balked at its gate. Children dared each other to run past at dusk, ears straining for the phantom lullaby. The story traveled farther, carried by traders, preachers, fugitives on secret trails. In other states, the tale bent again. Clara became a shadow queen, a conjure woman, a saint of vengeance. Some said she used roots and prayers, others that she struck bargains with spirits in the woods. Each version grew darker, more powerful. Clara ceased to be only a woman. She became a symbol, a warning, a hope. Decades later, after the war and emancipation, freedmen still spoke her name around campfires. Veterans of the Union Army remembered hearing of the woman who poisoned her master. In Reconstruction meetings, her name was invoked like a battle hymn. Some printed handbills even turned her into a figure of folk resistance, placing her alongside names of uprisings long buried by white history. But legends are never safe. Her story was twisted too. In dime novels sold in the North, Clara was cast as a savage temptress, a murderess whose poison was lust as much as herbs. Southern papers called her a disgraceful myth, something better forgotten. Yet forgetting proved impossible, because the lullaby lingered. In small black churches, a hymn sometimes broke out, soft, low, with a melody that no one could quite trace. It had no verses in the books, yet the old ones sang it anyway, and always, someone would whisper afterward. That was Clara's song. Children in Alabama grew up daring each other to hum it after dark, as if the sound itself could summon her ghost. Some swore they heard chains rattle if they sang too loud. Others said a flame flickered in the hearth when her name was spoken. By the turn of the century, Clara was half legend, half memory. Historians rarely wrote her name, but in kitchens, fields, and midnight stories she was alive. A woman who had burned her mark into history with fire and poison. The masters had coffins, portraits, stones. Clara had a song, and the song endured. History remembers the masters in ledgers and wills, in portraits that still hang in dusty halls. But Clara's memory survives in whispers, in the trembling of children who hum her lullaby, in the uneasy silence of those who tell her story only when the night is thick. What does justice look like when the law itself is a weapon? To the Calhouns, Clara was a servant, a shadow in their house, an obedient hand at the table. But in one night she overturned the order they worshipped. She proved that chains can break not only with iron, but with silence, patience, and a hand steady enough to pour death into a glass of wine. Her story forces a question. Who was the criminal, and who was the victim? Was it Clara, condemned and hanged for daring to strike back, or the masters who built their lives on backs bent under the lash? The courtroom claimed her guilt was clear, but history, whispered through the fields and kitchens, says otherwise. Clara's act was not simply revenge, it was testimony. Each sip of poisoned wine testified to lashes laid on her brother, to lullabies cut short by cruelty, to years when even the air belonged to someone else. She left no written letters, no books, no speeches. Her record was one night of fire and poison, etched into memory by those who witnessed. And so her ghost remains, not in haunted houses, not in superstition, but in the moral wound she leaves behind. A wound that asks us to reckon with power, with silence, with the cost of freedom. She did not beg. She did not run, and still her song burns. Clara's story is not a clean tale of heroes and villains. It is a wound, deep, raw, still bleeding into the soil of history. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman who lived under the shadow of chains, and in one night she chose fire over silence, poison over obedience. But what do we make of it now? Was she a murderer or was she an avenger? A victim or a revolutionary? If you were in her place with chains on your wrists and a lullaby of grief in your throat, would you forgive? Or would you burn it all down? History does not hand us easy answers. It hands us ghosts. And Clara is one of them, standing in the doorway between memory and myth, asking us to decide. So I ask you, what do you believe? Let us know in the comments. Share this story if it struck you, if the silence of history feels too heavy, and subscribe to hear more voices long buried, more stories whispered in the dark. Because here on this channel we do not let silence win. This is the slave resistance, and the story has only begun.